Okay, I want to welcome everyone to Succession Planning. Is Your Business Ready? We have our presenter today, Steve Bookbinder. He is actually one of our SCORE Boston mentors, and we're very happy to have him here today to talk about this fantastic subject. So, before we get started with Steve, I do want to make sure that you are taking advantage of all the wonderful things that SCORE offers. So I want to go through what we have available to you. Our goal, as you may know, is to share small business information. We do that in a couple different ways. One is through our website. The website is quite robust. You're going to find articles, podcasts, recordings, all kinds of great information, templates you can download from marketing plans to financial plans to business plans to budgets, you name it, it's there. Another way we share information is through our webinars and our workshops. Those are shared through our social media, through our newsletter, and also on our website. So take a look at the listings we have. We have a lot of we're always adding new topics and of course bringing back old favorites. So take a look there. I think the most important thing that SCORE does, however, is the mentoring. Our mentors are volunteers. They have a variety of experiences and a knowledge that they've learned that they want to share with the small business community. We're working with folks that are in every stage. We're working from those that are trying to decide if small business is right for them, to planning, to starting the business, to growing the business, to exiting their business. So if you don't have a SCORE mentor, please consider doing that. Beginning session is going to be learning about you, your goals, your challenges, and the mentor is going to work with you to get there, to give you a roadmap so you can be successful. So next question, how do you get a mentor? Super easy. There's multiple ways on the website. I think probably the easiest is just to put your zip code in the match me by zip code box. That will send you to the chapter that's nearest you. There's a form, and that information is used to match you to the mentor with the skills that you need to get going. Our mentors work as a team often. They'll invite others in as your needs change to make sure that you're getting all the information that you need. We are recording today, in case you aren't sure, and we will post that recording to our website. And I will put that information into chat so that everyone has it as soon as we have a few more people that join, so that we all get that information as to where to find that recording. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull down this share and get Steve's presentation up here real quick, and we'll let Steve get started. Oops. All right. 1 second. Share. Slide control. All right, there. Steve, you should have control.
Okay. Thanks, Teresa, and welcome everyone today. Glad to be here. We have a relatively small group right now, so that means that we can be much more interactive, which is great. Um, Teresa, I wanted to ask, I forgot one thing to ask you. Can people raise their hand if they want to participate?
Yeah, they can. I actually would just be easier if they go ahead and just answer in chat. Let's just
Answer
put
in
that.
chat.
Yeah,
Oh,
and if they want to, yeah, we'll start with that.
okay. So first of all, this topic, succession planning. And our subtopic here is, you know, is your business ready? What's really required to do succession planning? I'd like to have a really interactive session with you because again, we have a relatively small group right now. So if you could put in the chat take a second right now and put in what drew you to this session? What's your interest? What would you like to get out of it? Okay. Why don't we all take up 30 seconds or so and put your into the chat. What brought you here today? What would you like to get out of this? So I have a better sense of who you are. Okay. And you can even say what kind of company you have, etc. So we'll wait for about 30 seconds and then Teresa will read some of what comes from the chat.
Want to grow my coaching business?
Okay. So you're a consultant. Okay. What else?
Mhm.
Anybody else? Because we have about,
I'm thinking on starting a coaching business. So
okay,
this person's, yeah, so this is a second person. 65 years old, considering selling or working less, closet organization business. Currently looking to purchase an SMB and interested in learning from what business owners are considering in succession planning. Another says, I have a small business I began almost 2 years ago. I just want to learn how to streamline and build on what we already have.
okay.
Mm.
These are real interesting.
I have a small business. I began, oh, no, sorry. House cleaning, looking to possibly sell or considering my options. Glass and handyman business. So we have a nice variety today.
Exactly.
Yeah. Highly experienced bioengineer. Sorry. Leading a company that invented a cure for a disease that afflicts 25% of all women, but investors are concerned that I'll die in 5 years before we sell the company for $1.3 billion. So looking
Whoa.
for a plan there.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and I think that's probably all we're going to get for now. So let's go ahead and move forward.
Absolutely. Those are a range of things from people who want to learn more about coaching to people who are thinking about selling eventually to people who are looking to understand how to build their business as well. So, first off, again, I want to keep this fairly interactive. So, the reality I had a client, family owned construction company with a father and three sons in the business. CEO was in his mid 60s. Um, and he told me when I started to meet with him that there is a succession plan, but we don't have a real successor. What does this tell you? Anybody? Um, you know, if you want to speak up or if you want to put your comment in the chat, what does this tell you? Take about 20 seconds. Somebody who tells you that they has a succession plan, but we don't have a real successor. What does that mean?
Not really a plan.
Yeah, there's not really a plan. Thank you, Tara. You have
Yeah.
no idea. You have an idea, but you don't really have a plan, says Shalise. Yep. What else? Anybody else? Sons aren't ready. Yes, a very common problem. Nobody to take over after that person goes. Okay. Maybe looking to sell. Yep, that's also in there. Um, this was a company, and again, I appreciate the interaction here. This was a company that was not looking to sell. Um, they thought they had a bit of a plan, but the person that they thought could possibly be the CEO, they knew wasn't really ready. And the other problem was that the other two sons didn't necessarily go along with the plan, and that everything was really in the founder's mind. In other words, he kept all of this in his mind. There wasn't a particular development plan or anything like that. So there really wasn't a plan. There was just this idea, and this is not uncommon, that, Joe would be the successor. But there was no plan to develop Joe. There was no plan to work with the other two brothers to see how that might fit in. And of all the problems, Joe was the middle brother. He was not the oldest brother. And the oldest brother was the least competent of the three brothers. So if we go to the next slide, and this is not uncommon, that there's no plan, but people say they have a succession plan, but there really isn't a plan, and there's certainly no development plan. There's also a large not-for-profit health system, and who I worked with. And the comment from the chairman of the board was, we have a CEO successor. He's a doctor who really understands healthcare. He's charismatic in some ways, but he has limited people skills. What does this tell you? So let's have some thoughts for some other people about that. What does this tell you? Any thoughts?
They aren't doing what is necessary to develop the skills of this person.
Yep, I can see Tara. Thank you,
Yep.
Tara.
You need to be trained to work with people.
Yep. So two things come up. They aren't doing what's necessary to develop the skills for this person, and he may need to be trained to work with people. Now, here's this very well-known doctor, and yet he's not ready to assume the leadership, and we're not sure about how we get him trained. And as Thomas just wrote, he doesn't know business. Yes, many people who are identified as successors don't completely know all elements of how to run the business. And a not-for-profit or a for-profit is a business. Okay. What difference does succession planning make? Um, by the way, someone wrote in, Samuel, that he needs to hire the right team. Absolutely. He needs to bring in some other people who will support him. Um, and Gerald wrote in, I've been working with physicians for 56 years. And while their number one focus is money, they don't have business skills. Very interesting comment from Gerald. Yes, they think they understand that they want to make money for the business, but they don't have business skills. What are the business skills that we look at? Do they really, besides financial acumen, do they have the ability to lead people? And do they have other skills that are really important? Do they understand operations? So, and do they understand marketing and customer focus and things like that that are going to be important, whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit? Now, what difference does this make is that sometimes when you begin working on succession problems, many executives and the boards know the truth. They know that that executive you just mentioned, the people guy, doesn't really have the people skills to do what's needed. In the previous example about the successors in a construction company, they know that that middle son doesn't also have the skills to make things happen. And in fact, what the data shows is that the rate of failure and movement is actually higher than ever for the top positions in all types of organizations, whether it's a small growth business, like we heard about the biotech company, or a large public business, or private business, or a not-for-profit, or a family controlled. In fact, family controlled are some of the most complex issues to deal with. The irony is that in these times where things have gotten much more complicated, and right now we're going through obviously a lot of change, with a lot of people not sure how their business is going to make it in some ways, there's even less focus on these important issues. The reason for failure, number one, people will tell me that they have, or they'll tell you that they have a succession plan, and it focuses on the emergency. That is to say, what if somebody gets hit by a truck? That's what we call the succession plan. That's the emergency plan. But I've seen companies who don't really even have that, where there's a sudden death, for example, and we're not sure who can be the CEO. Often the chairman of a not-for-profit or a for-profit becomes the person who fits in. HR, quote unquote, manages the process. And HR doesn't have perhaps the heft or the skills or the trust of the company so that we really know. So we have a book, a succession book, and HR manages that and keeps it up to date. But nobody tells that CEO that he doesn't have the people skills. Nobody tells that middle level person that he's going to have to how to manage a family-owned business in that construction company. And so in the end, there's no accountability. We track it only on an annual basis, and that's what we do. We track it. We say, okay, because actually for-profit boards will say, who's the successor? We'll look at it once a year. We'll talk about it, but we won't really talk about what's really necessary. Now, we all know, and many of you know, that development is good for everybody. That's what everybody says. You know, I've been, doing what I do for many years, but I know that my development is always important. I'm always trying to learn more. But if an executive is really inept, or he's really lacking, or she's really lacking, then there is a coach, perhaps. And two of the people here are coaches. But very often, that's highly secretive. And the coaching process isn't always managed well. That is to say, the coach doesn't interact with the CEO or the chairman. Um, and so the coaches, often the executive who's offered a coach says, okay, I'll do it. I know I don't have the people skills necessarily, or I don't have the financial acumen, or I don't have enough knowledge of operations, but, I'll do it. So the question, though, is that's a reluctant situation in coaching, and that is a reason that it may not succeed. Who gives feedback is really important too. Best case scenario, a company or a division focuses on setting objectives. Remember, setting objectives in succession and achieving them. It is talent management, not replacement planning. And what I mean by that is just what we talked about. It's not about the guy who gets hit by a truck or the woman who gets hit by a truck. It's about talent management. It's about saying this woman doesn't have necessarily the complete trust of the organization. What are we going to do? And if there is a CEO, we need his commitment to the process. In the case of that construction company that I mentioned, the CEO basically said, okay, to me as the consultant, whatever you want to do, whatever you say is important, but you basically direct this process. That's not CEO commitment. In essence, he was afraid of his own sons. So there has to be mentoring from the senior people, from the chairman, from other people. If it is a coach, the coach has to make sure that everyone is involved. And it's a commitment to getting ready now, not next year. Well, a lot of people will say, well, the middle son, let's give it 2 years and see how he develops. No, that's not going to work. Um, you've got to really be thinking about how can I make this happen? And what happens, because I indicated a lot of people fail. What happens if things fail? People always turn to the recruiters if it's a large company. But what about the success rate of outsiders, bringing in somebody from outside? Well, that brings up what is called the issue in succession of grow versus buy talent. If you buy, you often still lack onboarding and coaching for the new person. And it's a very difficult situation. And that situation is called, if you bring someone in from the outside, the successor's dilemma. I'm going to talk about a funny example that I've been involved with over the years. I've had a long career of churches and synagogues. There could be a really great pastor. There could be a really great rabbi. And they decide that they have to bring in somebody from the outside, either the assistant rabbi or the assistant pastor is not really up to the situation. They bring in somebody, and what is the successor's dilemma? Who wants to tell me what is the successor's dilemma when you bring somebody in from the outside? Just put it in the chat.
Commitment.
Commitment. What do you mean by commitment, Jose? You can talk if you want. You can unmute yourself.
Well, he can't unmute
Oh,
himself.
he can.
I'd have to bring him in. It becomes
Okay.
very
Okay.
complicated.
Okay. Doesn't know the parishioners. Okay. That could be the case. So but what is the successor's dilemma? So sometimes they're not committed to the organization. Okay. What else? What else is the successor? You bring this person in from the outside, he has this great reputation. They might not mesh with the community, says Shalise. That's true too. But what's the reason that there's this dilemma that they don't know the pastor, they're not committed to the organization, they may not mesh? There's something else here. What else about the successor's dilemma? They don't know the culture, says Kiki. No training. There's something else. Okay. The issue in the successor's dilemma is that we had a great pastor, and now we've got Jane, the new pastor. And what do? We compare Jane to the previous pastor, Jill. And she suffers because we didn't do the training, we didn't help them mesh with the community, and people look back to what they had in the past. That's the successor's dilemma. I've seen this in 5 churches or synagogues. The new person, we all start out, he was wonderful. You know, he was the leading pastor or rabbi in Hartford. He comes here, but you remember our rabbi, everyone loved him. So that's the successor's dilemma, that new organizations who bring people in from the outside, it's almost as if we don't give them the training, but we don't give them the time or the plan for making sure, to use Shalice's comment, that they mesh with the community, that they become committed. Now, anyone coming from the outside has a tough time like that. But people are always comparing the person to the past. There was one leading CEO of a major hospital in Boston who was a legend. And after he decided to retire and they looked for a new person, everybody was not good enough. And so they went through 2 CEOs. And generally, what happens is the second successor, the first successor doesn't succeed, but the third one does. That dilemma, says Jose, takes years to overcome. And that's one of the things we have to understand about the successor's dilemma. That just going and finding somebody who was great in Hartford to take over your parish or whatever, or to take over your construction business, it isn't necessarily a success. I have a friend who is selling a business right now, and he can see that the people who are buying the business will not treat his long-term employees the way he did. And yet he's in a dilemma because he has a different kind of successor's dilemma. He's selling the business to people who may not be as good to his employees as he was, but they're offering a very good price. That's a successor's dilemma. Okay. There are a lot of inaccurate assumptions, by the way, underneath all of this. People will say, yeah, I know we should do something for this new guy. Um, but there's not that much you can do to do things better. Um, Desired competencies are constant over time. What do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a construction company, sometimes people will say, well, the nature of construction is the same as it always was, or the nature of biotech is the same as it always was, um, or the nature of technology solutions. It's not. Competencies are constantly changing. Um, and, you know, we have to look at what the competencies are. So I'm going to give you an example. There was a guy, this is in California, that I knew through another contact um, and this was a guy who had started his own renowned donut shop. Okay. And he was offered quite a bit of money to open 10 donut shops just like the one he had. Okay. It didn't work. Why? Let's hear from some folks. Why wouldn't that work? He had an incredibly successful business, invented all kinds of things. Why, when he went to open 10 donut shops, didn't it work? On the same model, even though he had all the money. Any thoughts from people? Put it in the chat. Why did that donut manager, wasn't he able to? Not the same commitment from management, lack of leadership. What else? Unable to scale. The value was tied to the owner. He didn't understand the competency of scaling, according to David. Now, he said, according to Thomas, and I worked with this man, that nobody cared like he did. But in fact, the people he hired cared, but he didn't understand how to scale. And Gerald put in an interesting note. He wrote, didn't know how to manage the supply chain. Absolutely. He didn't understand more complex operations. Location wasn't the problem. He didn't know how to manage an organization of 10 shops. And so he went around and actually told people, your problem is you don't care as much as I did. You don't work as much as I did. That wasn't the issue. He didn't know how to teach what it was he did. And he didn't know how to make sure that the supplies, the raw materials, the marketing, all of the things that needed to be done when you operate a business of 10 donut shops were done. Now, he blamed it on the fact that people didn't care as much as he did. But that wasn't really the issue. He didn't understand anything about really transferring, about really building value with someone else. He didn't know how to manage supply chains. He didn't know a lot of other things. He just didn't know how to teach these new donut managers his model. So that's an inaccurate assumption when people believe that it's just, and economic success dictates the careers of employees. You've got to look at things. Now, you've got to define the needed competencies. What are competencies? They're the knowledge, skills, and behaviors required for the position. Keep it simple, but make sure it's accurate. What were the skills that a new donut manager needed? What were the behaviors? What was the time? He didn't need to be there 24 hours a day. He needed to figure out how to run that place in the right way. Keep it simple. Don't go for what I call false precision and, predictive claims that if you're there, 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, it'll be a success. No, it won't. You have to know what really are the things the person needs. For example, in that construction company and in that not-for-profit, we developed 5 basic competencies and then spelled them out. What financially do you have to understand? The financial acumen of running the donut shop, of inventory turns. What does the CEO of a hospital have to understand? He has to understand the balance sheet. He has to understand what goes on at the lowest level of that hospital. How are nurses actually utilized? He has to be emotionally intelligent. That is, he has to understand the impact of what he says to people. He has to be very good at external representation. The not-for-profit healthcare guy, he's going to be speaking a lot of time in the community. The construction CEO is going to be making presentations to the most important clients. And he also, or she also, has to have strategic vision. That is, they have to be able to look 4 or 5 years from now and say, what does this hospital look like? What does this construction company look like? Are we all going to be an infrastructure construction company building roads? Am I going to have enough civil engineers to do that? Am I going to have the estimators to do that? In this big construction company, they neglected to realize, and the CEO neglected to realize, that they didn't have enough people who were really trained in civil engineering and estimation. And so you always have this sort of looking around. Now, what you want to do is the lingua franca that I mentioned is that you want to, with the board, the lingua franca is the common language. And you want with the board and the executives and people who are in the know to be thinking about these five things. That we need these five things in everybody. Now, you don't have to choose those five things. You could have your own sort of set of competencies. But in this particular organization, that worked well. So, off the top, do these competencies make sense? Have you seen when somebody has been a leader who didn't understand some of these competencies? Let's answer that question. Have you seen leaders who don't share those competencies, but just went on doing things? Any examples that anybody wants to say? Give you a second. Have you seen situations in business where people don't have these competencies? Okay, anybody? I guess you haven't seen, everybody has, okay. Lots of times, says Tara. Give me an example, Tara, if you could. Or anybody else. What competencies do most people see that people are like? Yes, in military organizations and bureaucratic organizations. Now, it is interesting, however, for Gerald's comment, which is that in military organizations and bureaucratic ones, you don't see it, is that the military, starting in the 50s, did a much better job of understanding competencies than anyone else at that time, even in private sector organizations, and still understands those for promotion. For example, that you have to have emotional intelligence, that you have to have vision. The scary thing right now is, and I don't mean to make any comment on what's going on politically, but if you say that the fact that people, that boots, having worn boots, that makes a difference. Having been boots on the ground makes all the difference in the military. That isn't necessarily true. The military is a 3 million person organization. That person better know, understand a lot of stuff. Um, Jose says lack of emotional intelligence, in which most leaders don't connect with employees. That is very true. They may be actually afraid of their employees. What do I mean by that? They come into a meeting and they say things that that really they don't understand the impact. When somebody's emotionally unintelligent, they don't understand the impact of what they're saying. Gerald puts in favorite saying of the irresponsible is that's above my pay grade. Yeah, if you're talking about all of these kinds of competencies, then you at least ought to have the competencies that reflect your pay grade. The military, for example, did fantastic work in identifying what are the technical competencies of Air Force pilots. Um, what are the technical competencies? What are the emotional competencies? And they did a good job up until now of really identifying those things and weeding out the people who didn't fit with them. In fact, emotional intelligence is absolutely critical to being a pilot. You can't be nervous. You've got to be able to do the things you have to do. And they can't say that's above my pay grade. They've got to be actually able to do things. And increasingly in the military, despite what's being said about, well, you have to have, none of this and none of that, what they're eliminating, what you see with some of the best pilots in the world, like Israeli pilots, is that they are incredibly technically proficient. So technical proficiency becomes an incredible standard for the new pilot because he's going against drones and missiles and everything else. So whatever you decide, make it the lingua franca, make it the language that you're talking about, so that when you meet, you're a leader of this hospital association or organization. You go out and you say, here are the financial issues, here are the operating issues, here's what I'm trying to do as a leader, here's what we have to tell the community, and here's where I think we're going to be in 5 years. Everybody's talking about AI, whether in fact that's going to reduce the number of people that are in companies. But right now, for example, hospitals, or right now, regular companies, but nobody's really done anything about that. We're cutting people right now in the government without any clear vision of where this leads. More guiding principles. Well, first of all, it's really a process, and it's about risk management. I get people all the time in SCORE who come to me and say, I really want to hire 2 more employees, but it's very risky. And my response is, yes, it's an investment. If you go to Fidelity and you invest in some mutual fund, the thing that sits at the bottom that says all investments are risks. And in fact, some of the biggest risks are in hiring people, because you do look at their potential for success or for failure, but there's no magic potion for that. You've got to do a good job of looking at their competencies. You got to do a good job of looking at your community and whether they'll accept this person. And then, all investments, especially investments in people, they have the potential for success or failure. If we don't do the right thing, I'll tell you one thing that was incredible that actually happened I'm not even going to say what was this particular large religious organization, is that after the new CEO had been there and they hired a man, had been there for a while, someone, and I was a consultant to the board, came to me and said, you should tell the CEO that he doesn't dress right. He needs to dress better. What do you think my response was? What do you think I should have said? Somebody comes to you and says, you're the consultant, you have to tell the person to dress better. Any thoughts? Okay. Why? Shalise says, why? There's always a balance between expectations, Tara said, and how someone wants to show up. Who haven't you told him? Why haven't you told him? That's one of the things that I said to the chairman of the board. You know, you hired this person. He doesn't look exactly like the former person who dressed very stylishly and, low key, but stylishly. We have to find a way. You have to find a way. I'm just a consultant. You have to find a way to help him understand how he presents himself publicly. Because the presentation, this is what it's called in the literature, the presentation of self is very important, how you look. And sometimes those comments are unwarranted. My first reaction when I heard this is, what does that have to do with being the CEO of this organization? He's not, he's not sloppy. He just doesn't look or present himself like the previous guy did. Um, but, this is where risk management comes in. Now, some people will go to the internet and they'll see, here's a succession. Here's the way they did succession at the old GE. GE was the model, General Electric was the model for succession. They had this thing called a matrix. You looked at the performance versus the potential. I can't tell you how many times I saw the GE model, and people would say, that's our succession model. And I would say, yeah, that's your succession model. It's also GE's succession model. You have to really decide what it is you want. What's your business strategy? What are your requirements? And then measure your return. If you made the right investments, how long is it going to take for this person to get up to speed? Don't plan for the short term. There are no short-term immediate answers in succession. How to get started? Well, the first thing is, if you've got an organization, whatever it is, what does leadership require at X, whatever your organization is? I didn't mean to use X to be confused with a company called X. Um, what does it require at your company? How does company X currently invest in talent? That is to say, do you have training programs? Are they good training programs? And this is an interesting question that always comes up. Recently, a person came to me through SCORE and said, I get along, I'm going to be the successor. I get along with the current CEO. Okay. So I said, well, this is a fairly large organization, almost 200 people. I said, you have a leadership team. How cohesive is the leadership team? Do the leaders of this organization act like a team, or they all go off and do their separate thing? Well, everybody does their separate thing, but they're all very loyal to the former CEO. That's a recipe for problems. You've got to think about how we want to make the leadership team more capable and that the team is complementary. That is, that if there's a VP of marketing, she works well with the VP of finance, who in turn works well with the VP of HR. That's going to be the question. And to what extent are you satisfied with your current talent? For now, for the future. The issue is not just the CEO. The issue is, have we got a good VP of finance who I can rely on? Now, in that example of the donut shop, this is the worst kind of venture capitalists who come and they say, okay, we're going to give you the money for this. And what I really care about is you, John, staying in your role and working like hell to build the next 10 shops. No. And venture capitalists and other investors can be very wrong about this. What they should have asked is, hey, John, do you have a team? How do you run that first donut shop? Because you're going to need a team. You're not going to be able to be in the other 9 shops or 10 shops right away. And every day. You can't be in 2 places at once. And yet you see this with entrepreneurs all the time. They expand, they run themselves ragged, and they don't realize they don't have enough talent overall. So that what changes do you need to make over the organization? You need to understand 4 real drivers around this. Number one, you're the employer. What are the growth and performance expectations? What do the customers want? What are the market forces here? Somebody mentioned location before. That's critical with donut shops. But what's happening with real estate, technology, economic context, competition, etc. And then, very importantly, and there's no magic answer here, executive needs. You're going to have somebody who's running this donut shop. How much are you going to pay him? What are the pay? What are the requirements? What's the training? And what, when you look around, is the age and profile of the talent pool you'll be looking for? You're looking for somebody who's under 30, who wants to work hard and has an opportunity, but doesn't have the background to run a donut shop first? Or again, if you're looking for somebody to run a hospital system, do you need somebody who's run a hospital system before, run a hospital before, or a church, or whatever? So you need to sort of understand these drivers. What are your needs? What's the market look like? And we have somebody from biotech. What does that market look like? I don't know whether you want to comment on the market forces in biotech. Anybody want to anybody want to comment on that? What are the market forces in biotech? What are the market forces in any of the businesses you're in? Let's see. Anybody wants to comment on that? What are the market forces in the businesses you're in that will drive the success of any succession? Anybody? Okay. Give you a sec. Research funding availability for pipeline development. Absolutely. Research funding. And right now, that's really pretty spooky, right? Thank you, Tara. Anything else about market forces? That's a perfect example. It's not an example in the construction company, but it's an example in any kind of tech. Anybody else about market forces? Biotech from Gerald is a very long-term business as it takes an average of 15 years and $1 billion to develop a new product. Yep. I want to comment on that because, again, the investment often comes from perhaps a venture capitalist or a private equity company. And having worked in biotech, it's an interesting phenomenon. The Often the organization can grow very quickly, especially if it hits with a particular drug or there's excitement around a particular drug. But often the people who run that company on the board will say something like, well, all I need is a good CEO and a good chief scientific officer. Well, that's not all you need. You need more than that for long term, for an average of 15 years. You need a lot of people who understand how to get a drug through the pipeline over that period of time. You're going to need lawyers, you're going to need marketers, you're going to need a variety of people at different stages, and you're going to need a lot of people with expertise in regulation. So Gerald says a very important thing in terms of market forces. You have to understand that when you think about succession. The availability of labor, David says, absolutely. Right now, if there's a common complaint that my clients come to me when they're thinking about doing succession or hiring is, I can't find the right person. I can't find the right person. And nobody wants to work hard. Well, there was the great resignation in the years 2000, 2020 and 2021. A lot of people became remote. Okay. Now you have this war between the people who got used to working remotely or hybrid, which is partly remote and partly on site. And you have those people saying, I want to continue to work like this. I don't necessarily want to be in a situation where I'm compelled to be here 5 days a week because I live in an apartment and I've got a commute that's an hour long both ways, and I don't even have time to do my laundry. So there are a lot of people. Now, economic conditions, this is how things can change. 2022, everybody's doing hybrid. 2023, trend starts to shift. 2025, Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase, one of the most powerful executives in the world, says no more remote work. Even though, even though there's no evidence necessarily that people who work remotely are less productive. Ironically, there's a lot of wasted time when you're on site, schmoozing and, standing around the water cooler and all that kind of stuff. That's the old axiom that, a lot gets done around the water cooler. So availability of labor is very clear, and trend forecasting is very essential. You have to understand where the styles, if you're in any kind of business where there are style issues or anything else, trend forecasting is absolutely important. Steps in building a process. First of all, you need planning. You really need to sit down and say, who is our talent? Not just the CEO, not just looking at one person. What are the assessment processes we have here? And Gerald also added just now, biotech and pharma need labs and people in them to develop products. Many other companies just need thinking, which can be done remotely. Distrust of his employees is behind demands to return to the office. Gerald, I would agree with you. And I want to repeat what he said. We need labs and people in them to develop products. But there are companies at different stages that just need thinking, which can be done remotely. Right now, in 2023, a lot of people agreed with you. 2025, now, especially because this current administration has decided that that with no evidence, no real evidence, that people who work remotely are less productive. And really, distrust of employees is behind demands to return to the office. And people will tell you that in interviews. The Wall Street Journal is fond of saying that, in fact, people want to work less and their motivation is lower. But I follow all of this data, and there's no evidence, there's no real hard empirical evidence to prove that employees don't want to work. If anything, right now, what you're seeing, especially for white collar employees, is 75 people applying for one position. So the actual number of people applying for positions is as high as ever. And now with these layoffs in the federal government, it'll be even higher. So Gerald is right. Distrust, you can't let that infect your organization. You've got to think thoughtfully. And here's Jamie Dimon, head of an organization that has 100,000 employees, basically saying, I don't trust that people are productive when they work at home, when in fact they're often working on financial, you know, tech kinds of things, inputting data. But, there are ways to measure it. But he said this and it sets off a lot of different sort of reactions. Planning, who knows what, initial commitments, etc. Analysis, the talent implications. You need to plan first, and then you need to analyze. What are the talent implications of the business strategy? I think Gerald just mentioned, if you're in biotech or pharma, you got to look at what kind of people you need for what. If you need an immunochemist, where am I going to find it? Find them. If I need lab techs, where do I find them? Do they exist? If I have a business in North Carolina or I have a business in Kendall Square, what are the different implications of that? Projected organizational needs. And what's the best structure you could have? For example, even in the donut shop, what's the structure? What's the job roles? That guy who ran his own place ran it as a one-man show, but that's not necessarily going to work in the next kind of place, especially in hospitals as they change, for example. Building, get a framework, a database. You don't have to use anything more elaborate than Excel, and evaluate honestly when you have a leadership review. In that construction company, which was relatively large, when we all got together, that were the leadership team without the three sons, remember who I started with, without the three sons and without the father, I did it deliberately so that people who had worked with each of the three sons could say, okay, as long as this is confidential, here's what I really think of Joe. Here's what I really think of Bill. Here's what I really think of Ray. And think about, how am I going to invest? If Joe is the guy and he manages to tick people off and he is too, in this case, too willing to go off very quickly and not consult people, what do I have to teach him? And delivering on the commitments. Delivering on the commitments. You need to put together summary documents. You need to assure confidentiality. You need to make sure that people follow up. You need to mentor and coach. And let's just say this is the warning. This is the hardest step. Because who's going to tell Joe that he really flies off the handle, that he doesn't have a calm response when there is a problem? He reacts, he's too reactive. Who's going to do that? And not just tell him, but mentor and coach him. And you don't necessarily need to hire an external coach, but you need to make sure that this coaching actually happens. Sometimes this is an external coach. Often companies can't afford an external coach. So you've got to do that yourself and think through those issues. So lastly, in this, assuming the pitfalls in the process, the review process, one of the pitfalls is assuming this is all straightforward, has rational, emotional, and political dynamics. Everything we do has rational dynamics, especially in high tech or any other industry, any in emotional aspects. You're telling this new donut shop manager in a way that doesn't sound condescending, but here's what you're going to have to do. And political dynamics. If there are three brothers who are heirs apparent, who's the old expression on the street was who's zooming who's trying to get close to this particular one or that particular one, or playing the odds that this person will be the CEO. It's hard to maintain commitments once the transition begins. That's why there is a successor's dilemma. Choosing is hard, but assuring a smooth transition is harder. Timing, got to figure out how you want to space this. Ignoring evidence that a change in leadership is required. Sometimes you have CEOs, the most famous one was of CBS News, a guy named Paley, who kept firing his heir apparents. He was the CEO of CBS, until he was 83. And by then, CBS had fallen competitively behind the other networks. Job roles, especially the CEO and the COO. Now, that's a pitfall because you sometimes don't get the job roles clear. Some people will, in big organizations, identify people as high potentials, high pose. There was one organization, honestly, who identified various people as high pose, and they became known as the BBs, the best boys, under the radar. So it's pitfalls, like what happened to the women, by the way. And there are also, there was one article written years ago about let's hear it for the B players. What happens when you say, okay, this is an ambitious person, but can't let him do it. Manage the communications process very carefully and don't misuse assessment tools. The most widely used assessment tool is called the Myers-Briggs. It gives you a reading like, yeah, I'm an ENTJ. And you use these assessment tools to somehow define people. Special issues in family-owned or controlled businesses, they're often called, when you have someone who is the son or the son-in-law, it's called the tests of a prince. People are always testing this person, and we have to, issues of emotional intelligence. One of the questions is, can it be learned? Some people don't believe you can learn it. Surviving a new CEO, letting the focus on candor and development slip away. That's a real pitfall. You've got to stay candid, but most of all, you've got to stay focused on development every year. Especially as Gerald said, when he was talking about the company that, thinking about a biotech, if it takes 15 years, you've got to think about development in a 15-year span. Is your business ready? Well, we're coming to the end. Succession planning is deceptively easy. Remember what I started with. You just have to figure out who's going to be the person who succeeds if somebody's hit by a truck. Just identify replacements. That's not succession planning. Good succession planning is about honest evaluation and development. It doesn't have to be that complex, even though we've talked about a lot of stuff. But it does require a process and taking risks and making investments in talented people. I do believe that you can do it right. There aren't always successes every time, but you can do it better if you do follow the kind of processes we're talking about, which are not just what Steve Bookbinder knows. It's what have been written about for the last 20 years. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back to Teresa.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that was absolutely helpful for everyone on the call today. If you need to watch this recording again, give me 24 to 48 hours to post it. You will find it on the score.org/Boston website. It'll be under the drop down for local workshops on the blue bar. Certainly, if you want to meet with a SCORE mentor, on this topic or another business topic, you can go to the score.org website. If you want to email me directly for information, you are welcome to do that. And my email is outreach@scoreboston.org. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
and any comments, get back to us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Bye bye.